Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for attending. I'd like to personally thank the faculty and staff and our guests, of course, for attending to hear graduate students talk about the things we think we know. But my name is Chris Beecher. I'm a third-year PhD student here at the Pine School graduate program. And the topic of my discussion this afternoon is Anchoring Jewish Ethnicity in Hellenistic Egypt, where I present a theory of Septuagint emergence. Switching.
Oh, sorry. Yep, I got you. Yeah. There you go. Try now.
There we go. Wonderful. The letter of Aristeas preserves the legend that the impetus for the creation of the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Torah, was Ptolemy II's desire to collect, if possible, all the books in the world. Up until the modern period, most readers believed Aristeas accurately reflected historical circumstances related to the emergence of the Septuagint. In recent times, scholars such as Benjamin Wright III have demonstrated that the letter more likely reflects the earliest example of the reception history of Septuagint origins rather than a reliable historical account. In light of this, the late James Aiken considered the question of the Septuagint's origins as, quote, the one fundamental question that remains outstanding. Sylvie Honigman maintains that there are no less than 5 views on the Septuagint's original purpose, none of which touch on my approach today. I will argue that the Septuagint was created as a series of anchored public representations to maintain Jewish ethnic identity in the diaspora. The structure of my argument will come in 2 parts. I present my argument first with the groundwork that defines terms crucial for understanding the cultural necessity of the Septuagint's emergence, and then second, potential socio-historical reasons for the Septuagint's creation. First, I'd like to define culture and ethnicity. In ancient Judaism of the early Ptolemaic period, culture, ethnicity, and religion were inextricably linked together, per the Jewish story of national origins as transmitted in the Pentateuch. Because the terms culture, ethnicity, and religion can mean different things to different people, I will first define these terms since they inform my study. First, I want to look at Dan Sperber's cultural representations. For argument's sake, I assume Dan Sperber's definition of culture and Frederick Barth's definition of ethnicity as I examine culture and ethnicity among the Jews of Ptolemaic Egypt. In his book, Explaining Culture, Dan Sperber proposes that the widespread transmission and adoption of shared mental representations, ideas, beliefs, or memories, composes what we call culture. He pithily states that, quote, culture is the precipitate of cognition and communication in a human population. Describing his model as an epidemiology of representations, Sperber explains how ideas are transmitted from one person to another via word of mouth or some other mechanism until they infect whole populations and consequently become shared representations. When these shared representations become fixed or anchored in a text or image, which are more resistant to change, they become public and cultural. Sperber's epidemiological model attempts to answer the fundamental question of why some representations are more successful than others in a given population. He posits that such macro phenomena as cultural representations are the cumulative result of 2 types of micro-mechanisms, one which brings about the formation and transformation of mental representations, and another that through alterations of the environment brings about the transmission of representations. Hence, ecological factors may pressure certain cultural elements to prevail over others and secure their longevity. Now moving on to ethnicity. Judean ethnicity in Hellenistic Egypt. In his book, Jewish Ethnic Identity and Relations in Hellenistic Egypt, Stuart Moore addresses the question of Judean ethnicity. He accesses recent methods of social scientific research aimed at defining ethnicity, its maintenance, and its markers in the ancient world. Surveying the field up to the work of Frederick Barth, Moore attempts to demonstrate the value of Barth's work for engaging questions of Jewish ethnicity in Hellenistic Egypt. Prior to Barth's work, the 2 prevailing approaches for defining ethnicity were structural functionalism and primordialism. And I will define those terms briefly. Structural functionalism understands society as a series of interlocking social units with coercive power to constrain individual action. In such a case, the autonomy of the individual actor is going to be minimized and opposed to reified forces. Ethnicity is a form of voluntary solidarity that is expected to dissolve by the, quote, meritocratic processes of a modern complexifying society, because these latter render the strict genealogical relationships of ethnic groups as moot. Furthermore, in this view, assimilation was a positive good that spelled the end of racial stratification. That's structural functionalism. Primordialism, on the other hand, sees ethnicity as fundamental and inherent to a person, thus making ethnicity a given. In this system, total assimilation is impossible because in any attempt to assimilate into another ethnic identity, the primordial identity would reassert itself. In contrast to the models of structural functionalism and primordialism, Frederick Barth's model posited that ethnic boundaries were maintained when parties on both sides of an ethnic boundary agreed that some specific markers indicated an ethnic distinction. Thus, the maintenance of ethnic distinctiveness depended on the maintenance of these ethnic markers. Markers could potentially change without dissolving boundaries insofar as they did not all change at once. As it relates to Judaism of the Second Commonwealth, Moore summarizes Barth's view with religion as a, quote, cultural trait which is organized by conceptions of ethnicity. Thus, Judean ethnic identity used specific religious behaviors as ethnic boundary markers. Religious behaviors such as, or beliefs and behaviors such as monotheism, circumcision, and Shabbat observance. An integration of Sperber's theory of cultural representations and Barth's model of ethnicity may answer the question of why the Greek translation of the Hebrew Torah was necessary. Sperber's model suggests we view Jewish cultural representations as the distinctive features of Jewish culture, such as adherence to Torah, monotheism, circumcision, Shabbat observance, and so on, Holocaust patrios, other things such as that. If some of these Jewish cultural representations are only well preserved as cultural representations, when anchored and transmitted in written texts, originally Hebrew texts, and these representations are viewed as concomitant with Jewish ethnic markers in the Ptolemaic period, then the Greek translation represents a transformed repository for cultural representation / ethnic markers to preserve ethnic boundaries. Hence, the Septuagint is the means whereby Jewish culture and ethnicity are anchored and enshrined for the preservation of the Jewish people as a people in the Hellenistic world. The fusion of Sperber's and Barth's models suggests an organic connection between Jewish ethnic markers and boundaries in Egypt and the emergence of the Septuagint. So now I want to move to the second part of the presentation and consider social historical factors. Considering the synthesis of the two models proposed above, Septuagint origins are further illuminated by considering the social historical factors that may have created the need for a Greek translation. Sperber offers his model as an answer to why some representations prevail over others. I am essentially asking the same question about a specific expression of public and cultural representation, namely the Septuagint. In the framework of Sperber's model, I am considering the cultural macrophenomena of the Septuagint as the cumulative effect of the two types of micromechanisms. First, I suggest the pressure to Hellenize via linguistic and economic factors is the micromechanism which motivated the formation and transformation of representations from the Hebrew text to the Greek translation. Second, I argue that the micromechanisms that, quote, bring about the transmission of representations are one, the need to maintain Jewishness in a Hellenizing world, and two, the need to demonstrate that one could be both a good Greek and a good Jew simultaneously. And by good, I mean garnering sufficient social acceptance among the respective groups of Greek and Jewish society, thus enabling one to function meaningfully in the diverse social strata of Ptolemaic Egypt. So I want to first look at the language factor, whereas Greek is a must. Prior to the conquest of Alexander the Great in 332 BCE, the Jews of Egypt spoke the Aramaic language of the Persian Empire, as evidenced by the 5th century Elephantine papyri. In the wake of rapid Hellenization, the introduction of the Greek language was among the most important institutions brought into Egypt. This is per Joseph Manning. Hence, the acquisition of the Greek language provided a socio-cultural advantage to those living under the Ptolemaic rule. Greek language was acquisition among Jewish residents of Egypt, Greek language acquisition among Jewish residents of Egypt may have diffused through various avenues of social involvement. For example, Jews working in the military or government, as the Ptolemies preferred, would necessitate said Greek language acquisition. In time, the inevitable transition from Aramaic to Greek among Jewish leaders, scribes and scholars, as well as commoners, necessitated the creation of the Septuagint. Those Jewish leaders able to work in both Aramaic and Greek languages in the early days of the Ptolemaic Empire would have comprehended the importance of preserving Judaism in Ptolemaic Egypt. This process of preservation culminated in the Greek translation of the Torah, which anchored Jewish cultural representations in the Greek language. Furthermore, the Septuagint's evident dependence on its parent Hebrew text underscores its emergence during a linguistic transitional period. Benjamin Wright's application of descriptive translation studies to the Septuagint assumes that the intended function of translation determines its surface makeup, that is, how it is brought together as a translation. Since we cannot recover the intended function of the text, we must look at its quote, textual linguistic makeup to detect strategies that the translators use to realize that makeup. Ultimately, we see that the relationship between the Septuagint and its Hebrew Vorlage is subservient and dependent, since the Greek text relies on knowledge of the Hebrew. The Hebrew text thus stands above the Greek text and provides the conceptual context for its production and meaning. Hence, the Septuagint was not initially intended to supplant the Hebrew text. Moving beyond Wright, I would further theorize that over time, as knowledge of Hebrew waned among Jewish readers, the Greek translation became an independent textual source, as assumed in the letter of Aristeas and the writings of Philo. So I want to look now at the economic factor, or the Hellene status. Besides language, economics is the second socio-historical factor to consider regarding the Septuagint's creation. Specifically, there was a significant economic advantage that came with acquiring the status of Greek or Hellene. Considering the fiscal impact that the emerging Ptolemaic state had on the Egyptian economy, the papyri testify to the advantages and opportunities available to those who obtained Greek status, whether born Greek, Egyptian, Jew, or otherwise. The impetus of seeking such a status would be the exemption from the obol tax or the half the salt tax, participation in tax farming, a role that offered increased income and an official status in government, and a host of other financial benefits. Victor Cherikover's observation that, quote, large and varied numbers of Jews living in the Fayum in the 3rd and 2nd century Egypt suggests that many Jews would have been involved in the processes of Ptolemaic government. Since, as already noted, the Ptolemies preferred the involvement of Jewish or non-native residents in government affairs, both economic and military. Moreover, with Greek as the new administrative language, ecological factors developed that would assure the translation of the Hebrew scriptures into Greek as an advantageous endeavor for the preservation of Jewish culture. Thus, translating the Hebrew Torah into Greek ensured the survival of Jewish culture by anchoring representations in a text while also facilitating Jewish involvement in the realm of politics and economy. As Tessa Rajak writes, quote, the possession of writings in Greek denoted membership of the Greek club. Now the assimilation factor, cultural preservation. So resistance to full assimilation served as a mechanism whose roots are located in the Jewish idea that Jewish ethnicity is bound up with their divinely sanctioned religious vocation. If we understand assimilation to mean the absorption of one ethnicity into another with respect to culture and mores, such an idea would be contrary to Jewish ethnic and religious sensibilities. Although Stuart Moore, in his book, has pointed out that some degree of assimilation was not problematic for Jews, for example, their acquisition of the Greek language, the struggle for the Jews of Ptolemaic Egypt was not just avoiding complete assimilation, but navigating between the lines of faithful ethnic and religious adherence and total accommodation. The benefit of Barth's model, complemented by Sperber's theory, is that it adequately explains how the Jews could navigate between the lines in a manner that worked not only for their preservation as an ethnic group, but to their economic, political, and religious advantage as well. Two examples from Jewish history offer precedent for Jewish resistance to assimilation: the post-exilic books of Ezra and Nehemiah and the book of 3rd Maccabees. Ezra and Nehemiah demonstrates how Jewish leaders restored and maintained Jewish ethnicity in the wake of the exile by realigning culture and religion with Torah to create a stable ethno-cultural foundation. The pedagogical aim of Third Maccabees intended to encourage faithfulness and condemn cultural capitulation, which was equated with religious apostasy. Hence, perhaps taking their cues from the reform that occurred a few hundred years prior, the Jews of Ptolemaic Egypt brought the Hebrew Torah into Greek for the purposes of ethnic maintenance and national preservation. Both Greek and Jew, cultural transformation. Another mechanism at the intersection of social historical factors and religious strictures was the need to show that one could be both a good Greek and a good Jew simultaneously. Although there is no evidence that the Ptolemaic regime applied pressure to its various residents to Hellenize, the politics of the early kingdom certainly generated pressure for non-Greeks to Hellenize if they wanted to prosper under a new regime. In addition, it is possible to imagine religiously motivated pressure from Jewish commoners toward Jewish leaders to both maintain Jewish ethnic boundaries while adopting Hellenism to some degree. Considering such a scenario, the emergence of the Greek translation seems inevitable. If the Greek language was, as Manning states, one of the most important institutions brought into Egypt, the first step for Jewish leadership was to find a way to normalize the Greek language for Egyptian Jews. The challenge for Jewish leaders was not if Greek would become the language of Judaism in Egypt, but when. Even more, was there a way to make it happen sooner, to preemptively establish a Judaism that was both adequately Hellenistic and yet faithfully Jewish? The most logical course of action was to transform the Hebrew text of Judaism into the language of the regime, a language that would become the identifying mark of a truly Hellenized society. And the end result, Hellenistic Judaism anchored in the Greek Bible. By translating the Hebrew scriptures into the language of the empire, the Jews would have the very text that defined and shaped their culture in the language that would ensure their perpetuity as a distinct ethnic group. Furthermore, the Septuagint would provide those Jews living and working among the diverse ethnic groups of Egypt the language categories to function in both Jewish and Hellenistic spaces while maintaining their ethnic boundaries. The cultural representations that mark the Jewish people as Jewish would therefore be preserved, retransmitted into a new tongue. They would be preserved as a series of anchored representations that serve to maintain the boundaries of ethnicity in the heart of Jewish and non-Jewish social interactions. The benefit of synthesizing and using the models of Sperber and Barth is that the synthesis best explains how the Greek Bible was produced as a means to faithfully transmit culture, shared mental representations, and thus secure the ongoing existence of the Jewish people in Ptolemaic Egypt. My theory resists, therefore, the classical narrative that understands the impetus for the Septuagint as something that arose from the desire of the Ptolemaic monarchy, a desire to add a translation of the Jewish law to the royal library. Rather, my theory suggests that the need for the Greek Bible arose out of necessity on the part of the Jewish population of Egypt, a necessity to preserve and maintain Jewish ethnic boundaries. Although speculation may be offered regarding Ptolemaic involvement in the creation of the Septuagint, my theory places Jewish concerns for the preservation of ethnicity at the root of the Septuagint's emergence. Thank you. So do we have a few minutes for questions, or what are we looking at?
At 10 minutes.
Oh, 10, she says 10 minutes. Is that right? Okay. Yes, Dr. Kaufman.
Yeah, thank you. Always interesting to think about why these things happen. You kept using the word Torah rather than Tanakh, and I'm wondering whether that was intentional or not.
Yeah.
And how that would all, to a certain extent, relate to some of the things we heard in that Krause's talk, in terms of what was considered authoritative, and when, and why, in certain places in Egypt. Have you thought about that, or has others written about that?
Yeah, well, so the reason that was intentional, the use of Torah, because classically understood, the Septuagint refers to the translation of the Pentateuch. The books, the Ketuvim and the Nevi'im come later in terms of translation, some even into the 2nd and 3rd century CE potentially.
In the century, you mean Septuagint in Old Greek, or you're not?
No, not that. Yeah, I'm not referring to the Old Greek translation, right? So exclusively to the Greek, the Septuagint translation of the Pentateuch. And this would, because this is where most of the cultural elements are going to be in terms of commands and, cultural mores, things like that, are enshrined, I think, most clearly in the Pentateuch, at least for the Jews of Ptolemaic Egypt. Yeah, Dr. Saracen, I'll be sorry.
Okay. There's a level at which this is an unanswerable question, but
I thrive in those areas.
Yeah, we all thrive in those areas, exactly. But it struck me from the way you were presenting this, precisely if the Septuagint is early in the if you will, the transition to Greek. I'm thinking in one respect of the analogy of Mendelssohn's translation of the Torah into Greek, into German, Hochdeutsch, even though written in Hebrew characters, which was entirely essentially a way of educating Ashkenazi Jews in German. I don't know that, I mean, the characteristics of the Septuagint in terms of its textual surface would seem to presuppose a readership that already has Greek, rather than an attempt to spread Greek, if you will, among Torah readers. And again, there's no way of answering the question, but it sounded like, in terms of, at least in terms of your theory, that could possibly be an element in terms of how this might work.
Yeah. Can you repeat that for the
Yeah.
Right. So I'll try to summarize it as best as I can. So the implication of the text being written in Greek is that the people living in that time already understood Greek to some degree, otherwise it would have no value to them. Right. Is that a good in a nutshell? Yeah. So and that's one of the things I try in the paper. I dig more into this in terms of the linguistic translation analysis, I think is what I call it. So the fact that the Septuagint is a translation indicates that it was written in a transitional period. So I wouldn't be proposing that you have the elite who just picked up on Greek and they're like, maybe we should put this Torah into Greek, but that this is something where they're looking at the landscape, the cultural landscape, and they see these changes, and they're like, we really need to, we're losing our mother tongue, and we need to sort of redraw the boundaries, as it were, and preserve those representations. They probably weren't thinking in those categories, but preserve those representations in a language that is now rapidly becoming part of what we are as a people. Yeah. Yes, Dr. Krause, sorry.
So actually, in a way, just related to Dr. Saracen's question. So I was wondering how the Greek of the Septuagint, which really isn't classical Greek, which
translation Greek,
offended the scholars of Alexandria for sure. How that compared to things like the work of Aristobulus or Ezekiel the Phrygian or Philo the Epic Hook, and how they might be doing. Are they doing the same thing in a different way? And how you might compare their process of negotiating that cultural interchange between Hellenism and Judaism, where they're actually writing in good Greek.
Yeah.
Good, scholarly Greek. That would actually do that work of establishing their, social status within the community of Alexandria.
Yeah, no, so that's a good question. The question of whether, so we know that the Greek of the Septuagint does not resemble classical Greek directly. It's more of a translational Greek. Unlike authors like Aristobulus and Artapanus, I think, and Ezekiel the Tragedian, and their use of Greek, which was going to be more of a high register. I haven't compared them, but that would be an interesting comparison. And I'm not sure when I'm not sure when they were written in comparison to the translation of the Greek Septuagint, the Greek Bible. So in terms of that timeline, and whether they have access to this, or if it's a fresh translation from the Hebrew text, I don't know. So that would be a great exercise, something I should definitely look into.
Well, you're skeptical of the letter of Aristeas' contention that the Egyptian elite, were instituted.
Yeah.
Well, you leave the vehicle for how it came into being unknown, and you provide a conceptual framework for how that happened, or do you speculate or know, or how do you think?
You mean the text, the Greek Bible, or the letter of Aristeas? So you.
No, I'm talking about the Greek,
Okay. Yeah.
Septuagint, the Greek translation.
Yeah. I don't
How
think
did it
you.
come about?
I don't think you can definitively say.
Yeah.
I think I'm looking at what would be a potential cause, but
Okay,
I don't
yeah.
know the exact historical mechanism.
Sure.
Just a material sort of material cause. I think that's it, right?
Yeah, that's.
Yeah. Thank you.